Who is set up for tragedy and the incomprehensibility of suffering? Nobody. The tragedy of the man not set up for tragedy. That is every man's tragedy. So as you could see, I'm going to be talking about American Pastoral today by Philip Roth. Secretly, this is a book that I already reviewed, and I posted a video on it about a month ago, right after I had read the book. And I wasn't too happy with how that video turned out or the items that I was talking about. So I ended up putting that on private mode and just decided to film a new video that was a little bit more coherent and cohesive in my thoughts. But I'm going to start out by saying that I personally love Philip Roth. He's one of my favorite writers and someone that I really just discovered this year upon his death. I listened to a number of interviews about him and decided to give the book The Ghostwriter a try. And that book was very difficult for me to get through, but I recognized that there was something there and that this was a writer, an important writer, that I should pursue further. And I ended up reading the entire Zuckerman trilogy, and that is The Ghostwriter, Zuckerman Unbound, The Anatomy Lesson, and then a very small novella called The Prague Orgy. And that's kind of the coda to the entire trilogy. But American Pastoral involves this Zuckerman character. So while I wouldn't say that the Zuckerman trilogy is required reading before American Pastoral, it is kind of the same character, and maybe it would be good to know a little bit about the background of that character. A lot of critics have pointed out that this Zuckerman guy, who is a famous writer, famous for publishing a very controversial book, he is kind of the alter ego of Philip Roth himself. I will say that the Zuckerman in American Pastoral is a bit different than the Zuckerman of the Zuckerman trilogy. And in Roth's life, this is just the difference between his earlier work versus his later work. In the Zuckerman trilogy, there was a lot of outward existential struggle and self-rage that was kind of funny in a way. But you get this sense of a character that's raving mad and talking a lot and just spewing nonsense about how miserable he is. All of that seems a little bit converted in American Pastoral to kind of a general pessimism towards post-World War II American government and American society. Most of the storytelling happens just in the mind of the main character who I'm about to talk about. To set up the story, we encounter Zuckerman, who is again a famous writer, and he's kind of remembering his high school days. Why is he doing this? Because there's a reunion coming up that he's planning on attending, and in particular he's remembering a certain peer of his named Seymour Lvov, and this character has the nickname of the Swede. But the Swede was somebody that everyone looked up to. He was a sports star in high school. He became the inheritor of a successful glove business that his father started. He goes on to become the husband of a former Miss New Jersey pageant contestant. He's really just this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, dedicated father who owns some land and has this beautiful wife. And there were only a couple of times that Zuckerman had run into the Swede between the point of them graduating high school to the high school reunion. So the Swede is kind of a mystery to him, and he's wondering, with all of this glory that the Swede encountered in his early days, what really became of him. Unfortunately, he gets to the reunion, and the Swede's brother is there and informs Zuckerman that the Swede is dead, and he was destroyed by kind of these devastating events of his life. From this point on in the book, it never re-enters the present time, which is the reunion. The novel kind of seamlessly drifts from Zuckerman's narration to the Swede's himself. And I found this attribute to be the most striking and very interesting, because everything past that nearly 100-page introduction is Zuckerman's imagining of the Swede's life. And we forget about that as the reader because it just sounds like this story is coming from the Swede. But in reality, it's Zuckerman that is narrating events that he think may have happened to the Swede. So he's imagining a lot of this, and we never really know what is made up and what actually happened to the Swede. So I guess you could call this a frame story, but since it never returns to that setting where Zuckerman is the one that's actively doing the narration, I would rather consider it kind of a meta-narrative, which is very typical with Roth, so much so that a lot of critics have labeled this Rothian. But we learned that in the Swede's life, his daughter, whose name is Mary Lvov, was responsible for a post office bombing in their hometown in New Jersey. And this actually led to the death of one person. Afterwards, Mary runs away and nobody knows what becomes of her. But in the aftermath of this bomb exploding and the person dying at the hands of Mary Lvov, the Swede's life kind of disintegrates. His New Jersey manufacturing town, which is where his glove-making business is located, it turns from this perfect American city to a town of violence and vandalism and mayhem. His glove-making business itself is in decline and is soon to go out of business. And he's already had to outsource a lot of the labor to countries outside of the United States. His relationship with his parents becomes very fraught. His brother grows very bitter towards him. He eventually finds out that his daughter, upon running away, has been raped multiple times and actually committed more acts of terrorism, which caused more people to die. We learn that his friends secretly hate him. And lastly, his wife kind of grows to hate the life that they've built together. So that's the general plot of the story, and no, it never gets better. It's always event after event happening that seem to make this guy's life worse. This type of writing and that sadistic way of treating one's protagonist reminded me of a book that I recently read, and it's a book that I reviewed on this channel, and that was Bernard Malamud's The Fixer. And I find these two stories kind of similar in a way. Obviously, the settings are a lot different. Both books deal with protagonists that are having their lives taken away from them by outside forces. Both are going through this kind of psychological and existential struggle. The antagonists of both books seem to be the society itself waging war with the individual. And in a sense, I think that these are both Job narratives. Malamud's The Fixer with Roth's American Pastoral. But instead of God being the antagonist of the story, that's been switched out for society or government. Basically, both books are asking what happens when a man has everything taken from him, and what is the role of hope in the end? And that question, actually, that latter question, is where the biggest contrast lies between Malamud and Roth. I think that Malamud's work is very realistic in its depiction of suffering. Yet that book becomes an emblem of kind of an optimist's view of the direction of society. The trust that humans will recognize injustice and suffering as kind of an antithesis to humankind. But Roth, on the other hand, starts as a pessimist, persists as a pessimist, and ends a pessimist. His perspective is insistent that there is no God, so there's nothing that's kind of orchestrating these events. It's just kind of misery that befalls a certain man, but it just so happens that that misery just keeps piling up. The macro view of this is that through the Lvovs, through the Swede and his family, Roth has created this really sharp critique of the American political climate of post-World War II, the capitalism of 20th century America, and also postmodern society's slip into what he calls the desperation of the counter-pastoral, or the American berserk. The Lvovs have this farm where they're raising animals, which I think is the more literal reference to American pastoral. But on a more metaphorical level, this American pastoral idea can be swapped out for just this general idea of the American dream. From the outside looking in, It seems like the Swede did everything right and was looked up to by people like a god. And he spends his entire life trying to make the right decisions, only to find that he was wrong. Now, this book is very dense. It will take a while to read, and I think a lot of times I found myself struggling with what Roth was actually trying to say, which is interesting because he seems to get out the microscope and really zero in on the subject of one's mind or on descriptions of how things look. It's very Freudian in nature, actually, just kind of zeroing in on the subconscious of man rather than just the facade. I think it's that fact that makes this instantly kind of a piece of classic literature. It's one of the best books that I've read, and I would recommend it, though not to everyone. It is an R-rated book. There's a lot of adult content. I mean, one of the things that I really struggled with that turned me off about the book as I was reading was the Swede's description of how he envisioned his daughter's rape going. So that was just kind of very disturbing to me. But it's that type of thing that Roth doesn't shy away from. So I would definitely recommend this book to very mature readers who enjoy a slow reading process and also just a very working out of sophisticated ideas. The entire book is basically development. It's just development of the mind of these characters. So if you have the patience for that, I think that this is really the book for you. For me, I loved it. I love all of Philip Roth. And this is a book that has stayed with me throughout the past month that I have finished it. And I really can't wait to read it again.